When the construction crew arrived at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa, on that humid Tuesday morning in September 2009, foreman Jake Morrison expected nothing more than another routine foundation repair job. The century-old limestone church had been showing signs of structural stress, with hairline cracks appearing along the basement walls and a persistent moisture problem that had plagued the congregation for months. What Jake and his team discovered 20 feet beneath the sanctuary floor would unravel a mystery that had haunted the small farming community for 2 decades and expose a truth so shocking that it would challenge everything the townspeople thought. They knew about faith, sacrifice, and the price of keeping secrets. The morning started like any other renovation project in this quiet Iowa town of 8,000 residents, where everyone knew their neighbors and church bells still marked the rhythm of daily life. Jake had been running Morrison Construction for 15 years, taking over the family business from his father, who had built half the houses in Cedar Falls during the post-war boom. At 42, Jake prided himself on being thorough, methodical, and respectful when working on historic buildings, especially houses of worship. He understood that these structures weren't just buildings, but sacred spaces that held generations of memories, prayers, and community gatherings. St. Matthew's had been a cornerstone of Cedar Falls since 1898, its Gothic revival architecture, standing as a testament to the faith and determination of German immigrants who had settled in the area. The church's soaring spire could be seen from miles away across the flat Iowa farmland, serving as a beacon for travelers and a symbol of permanence in a world of constant change. Reverend Patricia Holloway, who had served the congregation for the past 5 years, had called Jake personally about the foundation issues after several parishioners complained about the musty smell that seemed to emanate from beneath the altar area during Sunday services. Jake's crew consisted of 3 experienced workers: Tommy Chen, a 28-year-old excavator operator whose family had moved to Cedar Falls from California when his father took a job at the John Deere plant; Maria Santos, one of the few female heavy equipment operators in the county who had proven herself capable of handling any machinery Jake threw at her; and old Pete Kowalski, a 70-year-old former coal miner from Pennsylvania who had relocated to Iowa for his health, but couldn't resist the call of construction work. Pete had worked on more church renovations than anyone in 3 counties, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the bones of old buildings. The initial inspection had revealed what appeared to be standard foundation settling, common in buildings constructed on the clay-rich soil that characterized much of eastern Iowa. The church trustees had approved a budget for underpinning the foundation walls and installing a modern drainage system to address the moisture problems. Reverend Holloway had been particularly concerned about preserving the original stonework, which featured intricate carvings done by German craftsmen more than a century ago. She had insisted that every stone be carefully documented and preserved, a request that Jake appreciated for its respect for historical craftsmanship. As Jake surveyed the basement area that morning, his attention was drawn to an unusual discoloration. In the concrete floor near the northeast corner, directly beneath where the altar stood on the floor above, the concrete appeared newer than the rest of the foundation, with a slightly different color and texture that suggested it had been poured at a different time. Pete Kowalski noticed it too, running his weathered hands along the surface and frowning thoughtfully. In his 5 decades of construction work, Pete had developed an eye for anomalies that younger workers often missed. The church basement served multiple purposes, housing the boiler room, storage areas for seasonal decorations, and a small meeting room where the youth group gathered on Wednesday evenings. The walls were lined with metal shelving units holding Christmas ornaments, Easter lilies preserved in tissue paper, and boxes of hymnals dating back to the 1950s. A musty smell hung in the air, the result of decades of Iowa humidity and inadequate ventilation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the basement feel more like a warehouse than part of a sacred building. Jake's original plan was straightforward: excavate around the perimeter walls to expose the foundation, install waterproofing membrane, and pour new concrete footings where needed. The work would take approximately 3 weeks, assuming they didn't encounter any unexpected complications. He had factored in time for working around the church's schedule, ensuring that Sunday services and Wednesday evening activities could continue with minimal disruption. The congregation had even arranged for Jake's crew to attend a special blessing ceremony before beginning work, a gesture that touched Jake more than he had expected. However, as Tommy Chen began carefully breaking up the concrete in the northeast corner with a pneumatic hammer, the sound that emerged wasn't the typical crack of concrete giving way. Instead, there was a hollow echo that suggested empty space beneath the floor. Pete immediately called for Tommy to stop, and the 3 men gathered around the small hole that had been created. Jake shined his flashlight into the opening, expecting to see soil or perhaps an old utility tunnel. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. The light revealed what appeared to be a wooden surface approximately 4 feet below the concrete floor. The wood was dark with age, but appeared to be in remarkably good condition, given its subterranean location. More disturbing was the fact that the wooden surface appeared to be shaped like a rectangle, roughly the dimensions of a burial vault. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what they had discovered. Churches occasionally had crypts or burial chambers, particularly older European-style buildings, but St. Matthew's had never been mentioned in any historical documents as having such features. Maria Santos, who had been operating the small excavator outside, came in to see what had caused the work stoppage. When Jake showed her what they had found, her face went pale. As the daughter of a funeral director, Maria had seen enough burial containers to recognize one when she saw it. The wood appeared to be high-quality oak or mahogany, materials that would have been expensive and typically reserved for the most respected members of a community. The surface showed no signs of water damage or rot, suggesting that whoever had constructed this chamber had taken great care to ensure its preservation. Pete Kowalski's expression was grim as he examined the discovery. In his 70 years, he had worked on hundreds of renovation projects, including several church restorations, and he had never encountered anything quite like this. The concrete above the wooden chamber appeared to have been poured specifically to conceal it, with rebar placement that suggested deliberate engineering rather than standard foundation work. Someone had gone to considerable effort and expense to hide whatever lay beneath St. Matthew's altar. Jake's first instinct was to contact Reverend Holloway immediately, but something made him hesitate. The positioning of the chamber directly beneath the altar seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. In most Christian traditions, the altar was the most sacred space in the church, the place where communion was celebrated and where the congregation focused their worship. To place a burial chamber in such a location would have required approval from the highest levels of church hierarchy, yet there was no record of any such approval in the church's extensively documented history. As Jake stood in that musty basement, staring down at the mysterious wooden surface that his crew had uncovered, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple foundation repair. The careful concealment, the location beneath the altar, and the apparent age of the concrete all suggested that this discovery was connected to events that had occurred decades earlier. His mind immediately went to the most famous unsolved mystery in Cedar Falls history, the disappearance of Deacon Harold Hank Sullivan in 1989. Deacon Sullivan had been a pillar of both the church and the broader community, a Vietnam War veteran who had returned home with medals and scars, both visible and hidden. His sudden disappearance 20 years earlier had shocked the town and launched the largest missing person investigation in the county's history. Despite extensive searches and a reward fund that eventually reached $50,000, no trace of Hank Sullivan had ever been found. The case had remained open, though active investigation had ceased years ago when all leads were exhausted. Jake realized that what his crew had discovered might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Cedar Falls for 2 decades. But as he stood there in the dim basement light, surrounded by the tools of construction and the silence of the old church above, Jake also understood that those answers might be more terrible than anyone had ever imagined. The weight of that possibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, and he knew that the simple foundation repair job he had agreed to take on was about to become something entirely different. The morning sun, streaming through the small basement windows, suddenly seemed inadequate to illuminate the darkness that Jake feared they were about to uncover. As his crew gathered around the excavated area, their faces reflecting the same mixture of curiosity and dread that Jake felt, he made the decision that would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change their understanding of what had happened to Deacon Harold Sullivan. In the autumn of 1989, Jake Morrison stood frozen in the basement of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, his flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air to illuminate the mysterious wooden surface 4 feet below the concrete floor. The discovery had transformed what should have been a routine Tuesday morning into something that felt like the opening scene of a nightmare. His crew members, Tommy Chen, Maria Santos, and Pete Kowalski, clustered around the hole they had created, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fascination and unease that gripped Jake's chest like a vice. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of discovery and long-buried secrets, we want to connect with our amazing viewers around the world. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from today, whether you're joining us from a bustling city, a quiet, small town like Cedar Falls, or somewhere in between. Your engagement means everything to us, and we love hearing from our global community of true story enthusiasts. If this story has already captured your attention and you're wondering what Jake and his construction crew are about to uncover beneath this century-old church, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you the most compelling real-life mysteries, shocking discoveries, and inspirational stories of ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Today's story about Deacon Harold Sullivan's disappearance and the shocking discovery made 20 years later is one that will stay with you long after the video ends. We promise you that what unfolds in the next several minutes will challenge everything you think you know about faith, community secrets, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is sacred. This isn't just a story about a missing person or a construction project gone wrong. It's a tale that explores the complex relationships between truth and loyalty, between individual conscience and community pressure, and between the past and present in ways that will surprise and move you. The story we're about to tell you spans 2 decades and involves some of the most respected members of a tight-knit Iowa farming community. It raises questions about authority, sacrifice, and the price of silence that will resonate with anyone who has ever struggled with difficult moral choices. As Jake Morrison and his crew stand on the threshold of a discovery that will shake Cedar Falls to its core, we invite you to consider what you would do in their situation. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what they had found. The wooden surface beneath the concrete wasn't just unusual, it was deliberately hidden, carefully concealed by someone who had gone to considerable expense and effort to ensure it would remain undiscovered. The concrete above appeared to have been poured with the specific intention of sealing away whatever lay beneath, and the precision of the work suggested professional construction rather than a hastily covered mistake. Tommy Chen, whose family had moved to Cedar Falls when he was just 10 years old, had grown up hearing stories about Deacon Sullivan's disappearance. Every kid in town knew the basic facts. Hank Sullivan had left his house on October 15th, 1989, telling his wife Margaret that he was going to the church for an evening meeting with Reverend Patterson, the pastor at that time. When Margaret woke up the next morning, Hank's side of the bed was still made, his coffee cup sat unwashed in the sink, and his pickup truck was nowhere to be found. The initial police investigation had focused on the possibility that Hank had suffered some kind of accident during his drive to or from the church. Search teams had scoured every back road, farm pond, and wooded area within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Falls. The Iowa State Patrol had issued statewide alerts, and Hank's photograph had appeared on missing person flyers distributed throughout the Midwest. His pickup truck, a distinctive red 1987 Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate from a farming accident, became one of the most recognizable vehicles in missing person databases. Maria Santos remembered her father talking about the case when she was a teenager. As the town's only funeral director at the time, Ricardo Santos had been approached by Margaret Sullivan about making arrangements for a memorial service when it became clear that Hank wasn't coming home. The conversation had stuck with Ricardo because Margaret had seemed more resigned than grief-stricken, as if she had already accepted that her husband was gone forever. That reaction had puzzled Ricardo, who had known the Sullivans for years and had always considered them to have a strong, loving marriage. Pete Kowalski had actually worked on a construction project at St. Matthew's in the early 1990s, just 2 years after Hank Sullivan's disappearance. The church had hired his previous employer to install new heating and air conditioning systems, work that had required extensive excavation in the basement. Pete clearly remembered that project because Reverend Patterson had been unusually specific about which areas of the basement could and couldn't be disturbed during the work. At the time, Pete had assumed the restrictions were related to structural concerns or utility lines, but now he wondered if there had been other reasons for the pastor's careful supervision. The more Jake thought about the timing, the more unsettled he became. If his rough estimate about the age of the concrete was correct, it had been poured sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s, exactly the time frame when Hank Sullivan had vanished. The location beneath the altar seemed too significant to be coincidental, especially given Hank's role as a deacon in the church. In most Episcopal congregations, deacons held positions of special trust and responsibility, often serving as bridges between the clergy and the lay members of the congregation. Jake pulled out his cell phone and realized that he was facing a decision that would affect not just his construction project, but potentially the entire community of Cedar Falls. Should he contact Reverend Holloway immediately and let the church leadership decide how to proceed? Should he call the police and report what might be evidence in a 20-year-old missing person case? Or should he continue the excavation carefully and document everything they found before involving outside authorities? Tommy Chen voiced what they were all thinking. "Mr. Morrison, do you think Deacon Sullivan might be down there?" The question hung in the basement air like incense, heavy with implications that none of them want. That they had moved beyond the realm of construction work into something that felt more like archaeology, or worse, crime scene investigation. The basement around them suddenly felt smaller and more oppressive. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, with an electronic whine that seemed louder than before. Boxes of church supplies and decorations stacked along the walls appeared to lean inward, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The musty smell that had prompted the renovation project in the first place now seemed less like poor ventilation and more like something organic that had been trapped beneath the concrete for decades. Maria Santos suggested that they take photographs of everything before proceeding further. As someone who had grown up in a family business that dealt with death and burial, she understood the importance of documentation and the potential legal implications of disturbing what might be a grave site. She pointed out that if they were wrong about what lay beneath the wooden surface, they would need evidence of their careful, respectful approach to the discovery. If they were right, the photographs might become crucial evidence in a criminal investigation. Pete Kowalski's expression was grim as he examined the edges of the wooden surface that were visible through the hole they had created. His decades of experience with construction materials told him that the wood was high-quality hardwood, probably oak or cherry, that had been carefully finished and sealed. This wasn't rough lumber or construction-grade material. It was the kind of wood used for furniture or, as Maria had suggested, burial containers. The craftsmanship, visible even through the small opening, suggested that considerable money and skill had been invested in whatever lay beneath the church floor. Jake found himself thinking about Hank Sullivan not as a missing person case study, but as a real human being who had been an integral part of this church community. According to the stories Jake had heard over the years, Hank had been beloved by the congregation, especially for his work with the youth group and his efforts to help other veterans adjust to civilian life after returning from military service. His disappearance had left a hole in the church that had never been completely filled, and his wife, Margaret, had eventually moved away from Cedar Falls, unable to bear the constant reminders of her missing husband. The weight of potential responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. If they had indeed discovered Hank Sullivan's remains, the implications would ripple through Cedar Falls like an earthquake. Questions would be raised about how and why his body had ended up beneath the church altar, about who had known the truth all these years, and about what other secrets might be buried in the seemingly peaceful farming community. The simple foundation repair that Jake had agreed to undertake was rapidly becoming something that could destroy lives and shatter long-held beliefs about the people and institutions that had shaped Cedar Falls for generations. As Jake stood there, in the basement of St. Matthew's, surrounded by his crew and the evidence of their shocking discovery, he realized that they had reached a point of no return. Whatever they decided to do next would set in motion events that would forever change their understanding of what had happened in Cedar Falls during the autumn of 1989. The question was no longer whether they should investigate further, but whether they were prepared for the truth they might uncover. Jake Morrison had lived in Cedar Falls his entire life, 42 years that had given him deep roots in the black Iowa soil and an intimate understanding of the community's rhythms, secrets, and unspoken rules. Born in the same hospital where his own children would later take their first breaths, Jake represented the third generation of Morrisons to work construction in eastern Iowa. His grandfather, Emil Morrison, had arrived from Norway in 1923 with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable work ethic, eventually building the company that would support 3 generations of his family. Jake's father, Robert Morrison, had expanded the family business during the post-war construction boom, building ranch houses and split levels for returning veterans who were starting families and chasing the American dream across the prairie landscapes of Iowa. Robert had taught Jake that construction work wasn't just about pouring concrete and framing walls. It was about understanding the stories that buildings told, respecting the craftsmanship of previous generations, and recognizing that every structure had a history that extended far beyond its blueprints and building permits. Growing up in a town where his family name was synonymous with quality construction work had given Jake a unique perspective on Cedar Falls and its inhabitants. Over the years, Morrison Construction had worked on virtually every significant building in town. The high school gymnasium where Jake had played basketball, the library where he had spent countless childhood afternoons, the medical clinic where his own children had received their vaccinations, and dozens of the homes where his neighbors had raised their families. This extensive involvement in the community's infrastructure had given Jake insights into the private lives and hidden struggles of Cedar Falls residents that few other people possessed. The Morrison family had always prided itself on discretion and professionalism. Robert Morrison had taught his son that construction workers often saw things that homeowners preferred to keep private. Financial struggles evidenced by deferred maintenance, family tensions revealed through heated arguments during renovation projects, and personal secrets that became apparent when you spent weeks working in someone's intimate living spaces. The unofficial Morrison family motto was, "We build walls, but we don't tell tales," a philosophy that had earned them the trust and respect of virtually everyone in Cedar Falls. Jake's relationship with St. Matthew's Episcopal Church went back to his childhood, when his mother, Dorothy Morrison, had served as the church organist for nearly 20 years. Jake had grown up in the wooden pews of the sanctuary, attending Sunday services, youth group meetings, and countless church suppers in the fellowship hall. He had been confirmed in the church as a teenager, married his wife Sarah in front of the altar that now stood above their shocking discovery, and had brought his own children to the same Sunday school classes where he had learned about faith, morality, and community responsibility. The church had played a central role in defining Jake's understanding of right and wrong, service and sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for truth, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Reverend Patterson, who had served St. Matthew's during Jake's formative years, had been a powerful influence on the young man's developing sense of ethics and social responsibility. Patterson's sermons about moral courage and individual accountability had shaped Jake's approach to business, family, and community involvement in ways that he was only beginning to fully understand as an adult. Jake's expertise in construction and renovation had been honed through formal training at Iowa State University, where he had studied civil engineering, and through decades of hands-on experience working alongside some of the most skilled craftsmen in the Midwest. He had developed a reputation for being able to read buildings like books, understanding how structures aged, settled, and revealed their histories through subtle signs that less experienced eyes might miss. His ability to diagnose structural problems, identify original construction techniques, and predict how buildings would respond to renovation work had made Morrison Construction the preferred contractor for historic preservation projects throughout eastern Iowa. The company's portfolio included restoration work on several 19th-century churches, courthouse renovations that had preserved architectural details while updating buildings for modern use, and the careful rehabilitation of Victorian homes that had been designated as historic landmarks. Jake's respect for historical craftsmanship and his commitment to preserving architectural heritage had earned him recognition from state preservation societies and had led to consulting opportunities on projects far beyond Cedar Falls. His expertise wasn't just technical, it was cultural, rooted in a deep appreciation for the skills and artistry of previous generations of builders. Jake's personal life reflected the same values of stability, commitment, and community involvement that characterized his professional work. He had married Sarah Kellerman, his high school sweetheart, immediately after graduating from Iowa State, and they had built their life together in Cedar Falls, with the same careful attention to detail that Jake brought to his construction projects. Their marriage had produced 3 children: Michael, now 18 and preparing for college, Jennifer, 16 and already showing signs of inheriting her father's analytical mind, and David, 14 and passionate about baseball and American history. The Morrison family lived in a restored 1920s craftsman bungalow that Jake had purchased as a wreck and spent 5 years carefully renovating, preserving original details while updating systems for modern comfort and efficiency. The house served as both a family home and a showcase for Jake's restoration philosophy, demonstrating how respect for historical craftsmanship could be combined with contemporary functionality. Neighbors often stopped by to admire the original oak woodwork that Jake had painstakingly restored, the period-appropriate light fixtures he had tracked down through antique dealers, and the carefully maintained gardens that Sarah had designed. To complement the home's architectural character, Jake's standing in the Cedar Falls community extended far beyond his role as a successful businessman. He had served on the City Planning Commission for 6 years, helping to guide development, decisions that balanced growth with preservation of the town's historic character. He coached Little League Baseball during the summer months, organized the annual church pancake breakfast fundraiser, and had been elected to the school board twice by margins that reflected the community's trust in his judgment and integrity. His reputation for fairness, reliability, and quiet leadership had made him one of the unofficial arbiters of community disputes and a person whom neighbors turned to for advice on everything from property line disagreements to family problems. The Morrison construction crew that stood with Jake in the basement of St. Matthew's represented the kind of diverse, skilled workforce that had become increasingly rare in small-town America. Tommy Chen brought precision and technological expertise to the team, along with a fresh perspective informed by his family's immigrant experience and his engineering education at the University of Iowa. His ability to operate complex machinery with surgical precision was matched by his understanding of modern construction techniques and his respect for safety protocols that protected both workers and the structures they were renovating. Maria Santos represented a new generation of women in construction, trades, combining physical strength and mechanical aptitude with an attention to detail that had revolutionized the quality of Morrison Construction's finish work. Her background as the daughter of a funeral director had given her unique insights into human nature and community dynamics, skills that proved surprisingly valuable when working in people's homes and sacred spaces. Maria's bilingual abilities had also expanded the company's client base to include the growing Latino population in Cedar Falls, families who appreciated working with contractors who understood their cultural values and communication preferences. Pete Kowalski brought 5 decades of construction experience to Morrison Construction, along with an institutional memory that spanned multiple generations of Cedar Falls development. His work on churches, schools, and public buildings throughout eastern Iowa had given him insights into construction techniques, material quality, and architectural evolution that couldn't be learned from textbooks or formal training. Pete's ability to diagnose structural problems through observation and intuition had saved Morrison Construction thousands of dollars in unnecessary repairs and had earned him a reputation as something approaching a construction mystic among younger workers in the trade. Jake's relationship with each crew member was built on mutual respect, shared commitment to quality work, and an understanding that construction projects often revealed unexpected challenges that required creative problem-solving and ethical decision-making. The discovery beneath St. Matthew's altar represented exactly the kind of situation that would test not only their technical skills, but their character, judgment, and loyalty to each other and to the broader community. Jake knew that how they handled the next few hours would define not only the future of Morrison Construction, but their own understanding of themselves as moral agents in a complex and sometimes troubling world. Standing in that basement, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the evidence of their shocking discovery, Jake Morrison realized that his 42 years of life in Cedar Falls had been preparation for this moment. His technical expertise, community relationships, and moral foundation would all be tested as he and his crew grappled with the implications of what they had found beneath the altar of the church, where he had learned the difference between right and wrong, The basement of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church had always served as the practical heart of the congregation's daily operations. A utilitarian space that hummed with the quiet efficiency of church life even when the sanctuary above stood, empty and silent. Located beneath the main worship area, the basement stretched the full length of the building, its limestone foundation walls bearing witness to more than a century of Cedar Falls winters and the patient craftsmanship of German immigrant masons who had built structures designed to last for generations. The space was divided into several distinct areas, each serving specific functions that had evolved over the decades as the congregation's needs changed and modernized. The largest section housed the church's heating and cooling systems, a maze of ductwork and pipes that had been updated multiple times since the building's construction in 1898. The original coal-fired boiler had given way to oil heat in the 1940s, then to natural gas in the 1970s, and finally to the current high-efficiency system that had been installed just 5 years earlier with funds raised through a special building campaign. Adjacent to the mechanical room was the church's storage area, where decades of accumulated supplies created an informal museum of changing liturgical practices and community activities. Metal shelving units lined the walls, supporting boxes of Christmas decorations that dated back to the 1950s, Easter banners sewn by long-dead church ladies, and sets of dishes that had served countless potluck dinners and wedding receptions. Halloween costumes from children's pageants hung in garment bags alongside choir robes that had been retired when the congregation could no longer afford a full-time music director. The northeast corner of the basement, where Jake's crew had made their shocking discovery, had historically served as a meeting space for various church committees and youth activities. A collection of folding tables and stackable chairs occupied one wall, ready to be arranged for everything from confirmation classes to church council meetings. The space had been configured and reconfigured countless times over the years, adapting to the changing demographics and interests of the congregation, as farming families gave way to commuters who worked in larger Iowa cities but preferred the pace and values of small-town life. The basement's most distinctive feature was its collection of stained glass windows that had been removed from the sanctuary during a renovation in the 1960s. Rather than disposing of the beautiful but damaged panels, church members had carefully stored them in the basement, with hopes of eventual restoration. The windows depicted scenes from the life of Christ, their jewel-toned glass still glowing with ethereal beauty despite decades of neglect and the accumulation of dust that dimmed their original brilliance. Many church members had forgotten about the windows entirely, but Pete Kowalski remembered admiring them during his previous work in the basement and had often wondered why they had never been restored to their original position. The concrete floor that had concealed the mysterious wooden chamber beneath showed signs of multiple repairs and modifications over the decades, evidence of the constant adaptation required to maintain an aging building. Utility lines had been rerouted several times, leaving patches of newer concrete that marked where walls had been moved or systems upgraded. The floor sloped gently toward a central drain that handled condensation from the air conditioning system and occasional flooding. During severe storms that overwhelmed Cedar Falls' aging storm sewer system, church records indicated that the basement had been completely renovated in 1991, 2 years after Deacon Harold Sullivan's disappearance, as part of a major building improvement campaign that had also included roof repairs, window restoration, and the installation of modern lighting throughout the sanctuary. The renovation had been overseen by Reverend Patterson, who had insisted on personally supervising all aspects of the work to ensure that the church's historical character was preserved while bringing the building up to contemporary safety and accessibility standards. The timing of that renovation now struck Jake Morrison as suspicious, particularly given the careful way the concrete had been poured over the wooden chamber they had discovered. The work had been performed by a construction company from Waterloo, about 40 miles away, rather than by local contractors who might have been more familiar with the building's history and more likely to ask questions about unusual discoveries. Church financial records from that period showed payments to Kellerman Construction that totaled nearly $75,000, a substantial sum for a small-town congregation that had struggled with declining membership and reduced offerings. Throughout the 1980s, the basement's lighting system consisted of fluorescent fixtures that had been installed during the 1991 renovation, replacing the original incandescent bulbs that had provided inadequate illumination for the various activities that took place in the space. The new lighting was bright and efficient, but created harsh shadows that made the basement feel more institutional than sacred, unlike the warm glow that filtered down from the sanctuary's stained glass windows during daytime services. On this Tuesday morning in September 2009, the fluorescent lights hummed with an electronic persistence that seemed to amplify the tension surrounding Jake's crew's discovery. The basement's ventilation system had been a persistent problem throughout the church's history, contributing to the musty smell that had finally prompted the congregation to hire Morrison Construction for foundation repairs. The original building design had included minimal air circulation in the basement, and subsequent renovations had failed to adequately address the moisture issues that plagued below-grade spaces in Iowa's humid climate. Dehumidifiers ran constantly. During summer months, their steady humming adding to the electronic symphony of modern equipment that kept the old building functional. Storage boxes throughout the basement contained records and artifacts that chronicled more than a century of church history, from handwritten meeting minutes dating to the 1920s to photograph albums documenting baptisms, weddings, and confirmations spanning multiple generations of Cedar Falls families. Many longtime congregation members had donated personal items related to church history, creating an unofficial archive that no one had ever properly catalogued or organized. Among these materials were programs from memorial services, including the service held for Deacon Harold Sullivan in 1992, when the congregation had finally accepted that he was not coming home. The church's financial records from the late 1980s and early 1990s, stored in filing cabinets near the stairs leading to the main floor, showed unusual patterns of income and expenditure that had never been fully explained to the congregation. Large donations had appeared from anonymous sources during the period immediately following Sullivan's disappearance, providing funds for building improvements that the church had been unable to afford during the economically challenging farming recession of the mid-1980s. These donations had allowed the congregation to complete the basement renovation and other improvements without taking on debt or conducting the kind of extensive fundraising campaigns that had characterized previous building projects. The basement's location beneath the sanctuary gave it a peculiar acoustic quality that amplified sounds from above while muffling noises from outside the building. Congregation members working in the basement during services could hear every word of sermons and hymns, creating an intimate connection between the utilitarian space below and the sacred activities above. This acoustic relationship meant that anyone working in the basement during the period when the wooden chamber was being concealed would have been acutely aware of activities in the sanctuary, making it unlikely that such work could have been performed without the knowledge and cooperation of church leadership. The basement's temperature remained relatively constant throughout the year, protected from seasonal variations by the thermal mass of the limestone foundation and the insulating effect of being below ground. This stability had made the space ideal for storing sensitive materials like church records and seasonal decorations, but it also meant that organic materials buried beneath the concrete floor would decompose slowly, potentially preserving evidence that might otherwise have deteriorated in Iowa's extreme climate conditions. As Jake Morrison stood in this familiar space that morning, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of a century of church life, he realized that the basement of St. Matthew's had been carefully prepared to keep secrets. The 1991 renovation had not only modernized the building's systems, but had also created the perfect conditions for concealing evidence of whatever had happened to Deacon Harold Sullivan in the autumn of 1989. The question now facing Jake and his crew was whether they were prepared to uncover truths that the church leadership had gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide. The morning of October 15th, 1989, had begun like countless others in the life of Deacon Harold "Hank" Sullivan, with the familiar rhythm of a man whose days were structured by duty, faith, and an unwavering commitment to serving his community. At 53 years old, Hank possessed the weathered dignity of someone who had survived both war and peace, carrying himself with the quiet confidence that came from having faced down mortality in the jungles of Vietnam and emerged with his principles intact. His daily routine reflected the disciplined habits of a career soldier who had successfully transitioned to civilian life without losing the organizational skills and moral clarity that had made him an effective leader in both military and church contexts. Hank's morning had started at 5:30 with the coffee ritual that had anchored his days for more than 2 decades. He ground the beans himself, a small luxury that reminded him of the importance of taking care in even the smallest tasks, and sat at his kitchen table reading the Cedar Rapids Gazette while watching the sunrise paint the Iowa sky in shades of amber and rose. The newspaper that morning had carried stories about the fall of the Berlin Wall and political changes in Eastern Europe that resonated deeply with Hank's understanding of freedom and the price that had been paid to preserve it. His own service in Vietnam had taught him that liberty was never guaranteed, and that each generation had to earn and defend the rights that previous generations had sacrificed to secure. Margaret Sullivan had joined her husband for breakfast, as she had every morning for the 28 years of their marriage, sharing quiet conversation about their grown children, plans for the upcoming church harvest festival, and Hank's concerns about several veterans in the community who were struggling with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Hank had become an unofficial counselor for returning servicemen, using his own experience and natural empathy to help other soldiers adjust to civilian life and find meaning beyond their military service. His kitchen table had become a gathering place for men who needed someone who understood the particular challenges of leaving behind the structure and purpose of military life. The day had proceeded normally through Hank's work as a supervisor at the John Deere plant, where his combination of technical skill and leadership ability had earned him the respect of both management and the union workers under his supervision. Hank approached his job with the same dedication he brought to his church responsibilities, understanding that honest work was itself a form of service, and that treating people with dignity and fairness was as important as meeting production quotas. His colleagues knew him as someone who could be counted on to listen to problems, offer practical advice, and stand up for what was right even when it was politically expedient to remain silent. Throughout that Tuesday, Hank had seemed his usual self to co-workers and neighbors who interacted with him. He had eaten lunch with his regular group in the plant cafeteria, discussing the World Series and debating whether the Oakland Athletics could maintain their lead over the San Francisco Giants. He had stopped at Ferguson's hardware store on his way home to pick up supplies for a repair project at the church, chatting with owner Bill Ferguson about the unusually warm October weather and the prospects for the high school football team's playoff chances. These ordinary interactions would later take on profound significance as investigators tried to reconstruct Hank's final day and understand his state of mind. The first hint that something unusual was developing had come during the early evening, hours when Hank received a telephone call that Margaret later described as brief and somewhat cryptic. She had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when the phone rang, and while she hadn't listened to the conversation, she had noticed that Hank's responses were limited to "Yes, I understand," and "I'll be there." When she asked about the call, after Hank hung up, he had explained that Reverend Patterson needed to meet with him that evening to discuss some urgent church business that couldn't wait until the regular deacons' meeting scheduled for the following week. Margaret had found the timing somewhat odd, since Reverend Patterson typically preferred to handle church business during regular office hours and had rarely called emergency meetings in the 5 years he had served St. Matthew's congregation. However, Hank had been serving as a deacon for more than 15 years and was accustomed to occasional urgent requests for his counsel or assistance. His role in the church extended far beyond the formal duties outlined in the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. He had become a trusted advisor to multiple pastors and a bridge between the clergy and the lay members of the congregation who often felt more comfortable discussing sensitive issues with Hank than with the ordained minister. Hank's position as a deacon carried particular weight in the Episcopal tradition, where deacons were expected to serve as advocates for the marginalized and to help the church engage with social justice issues in the broader community. His military service and his work with struggling veterans had given him credibility in addressing difficult topics related to poverty, mental health, and the challenges facing working-class families in an increasingly complex economy. Church members frequently sought his advice on personal problems, financial difficulties, and family crises, trusting his discretion and his ability to offer both practical help and spiritual guidance. The evening meeting that Reverend Patterson had requested was ostensibly related to concerns about the church's financial situation and some irregularities that had been discovered in the building fund accounts. For several months, there had been whispered discussions among church leadership about money that seemed to be missing from special collections and fundraising events, discrepancies that were small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough to represent a serious problem if they continued unchecked. Hank's background in accounting, developed through his military service and refined through years of managing church finances, made him the logical person to investigate these concerns and recommend corrective action. However, the true nature of the concerns that Reverend Patterson wanted to discuss with Hank that evening went far beyond simple financial irregularities. Over the preceding weeks, Hank had been conducting his own quiet investigation into the missing money and had discovered patterns that suggested deliberate embezzlement rather than accounting errors or administrative oversight. His methodical approach to examining financial records had revealed a sophisticated scheme that involved manipulating donation records, creating false invoices for services never performed, and systematically skimming funds from collections that were designated for specific charitable purposes. More troubling than the financial crimes themselves was Hank's growing suspicion about who was responsible for the embezzlement and how long it had been occurring. His investigation had led him to conclude that the person stealing from the church was someone in a position of considerable trust and authority, someone who had intimate knowledge of the congregation's financial systems and access to records that were typically restricted to ordained clergy and elected lay leaders. The implications of this discovery weighed heavily on Hank's conscience, as he grappled with the tension between his loyalty to the church as an institution and his responsibility to protect the congregation from further financial exploitation. Hank had spent considerable time in prayer and reflection as he prepared for his meeting with Reverend Patterson, understanding that the conversation would likely force difficult decisions about how to address the embezzlement without destroying the trust and unity that were essential to the church's mission. His military experience had taught him that leadership sometimes required making choices that served the greater good, even when they caused personal pain. But his faith had also instilled in him a deep commitment to truth and justice that made it impossible to ignore wrongdoing simply because addressing it would be inconvenient or disruptive. As Hank prepared to leave for his meeting that evening, he had kissed Margaret goodbye and promised to be home within a couple of hours, telling her not to wait up if the discussion ran late. He had gathered the financial documents he had been analyzing, placed them in a manila folder that he carried in his briefcase, and driven towards St. Matthew's in his distinctive red pickup truck with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Margaret would later tell investigators that her husband had seemed unusually serious that evening, but not fearful or anxious in ways that would have suggested he anticipated danger. The drive from the Sullivan home to St. Matthew's Episcopal Church normally took about 12 minutes through the quiet residential streets of Cedar Falls, a route that Hank had traveled thousands of times over the years for meetings, services, and the various volunteer activities that filled his evenings and weekends. On that particular October evening, with darkness falling earlier as autumn progressed toward winter, Hank would have driven through neighborhoods where porch lights were beginning to come on and families were settling into their evening routines, unaware that they were witnessing the final journey of one of their community's most respected and beloved citizens. What happened during Hank Sullivan's meeting with Reverend Patterson that night would remain a mystery for exactly 20 years, until Jake Morrison's construction crew made their shocking discovery beneath the altar of the church where Hank had devoted so much of his life to serving others. The truth that had been buried beneath tons of concrete and decades of silence was about to emerge, carrying with it implications that would forever change how the people of Cedar Falls understood their community, their church, and the price that some people had paid for trying to do the right thing. The weeks leading up to Hank Sullivan's disappearance had been marked by a series of increasingly disturbing discoveries that painted a picture of systematic financial corruption. Within St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, what had begun as Hank's routine review of the quarterly financial reports had evolved into a comprehensive investigation that revealed embezzlement on a scale that shocked even his methodical, analytical mind. The missing funds weren't limited to petty cash discrepancies or minor accounting errors. They represented a carefully orchestrated scheme that had been draining the church's resources for what appeared to be several years. Hank's initial concerns had been triggered by inconsistencies in the building fund accounts, where donations specifically designated for roof repairs and foundation maintenance seemed to disappear into a maze of confusing transfers and unexplained expenses. His military training in logistics and supply chain management had given him an eye for detecting irregularities in financial systems, skills that had served him well in his civilian career at the John Deere plant, where he supervised inventory, control, and procurement processes. When applied to the church's relatively simple bookkeeping system, these analytical abilities had quickly revealed patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than innocent mistakes. The scope of the embezzlement became clear as Hank methodically traced financial transactions back through multiple years of records stored in the church office. Donations from memorial services had been diverted from their intended purposes. Money collected for mission work had vanished from accounts designated for overseas relief efforts, and funds raised through bake sales and church suppers had somehow evaporated despite careful documentation of the amounts collected. The total missing sum appeared to exceed $40,000, a staggering amount for a small-town congregation that struggled to meet its basic operating expenses during the challenging economic conditions of the late 1980s. More troubling than the financial losses themselves was the sophisticated nature of the scheme that Hank had uncovered. The embezzlement involved creating false invoices for services that were never performed, manipulating the records of special collections to hide the theft of designated donations, and establishing unauthorized accounts that were used to channel stolen funds away from their intended purposes. This level of financial manipulation required intimate knowledge of the church's accounting systems, access to sensitive records that were typically restricted to ordained clergy, and the authority to approve expenditures without oversight from the congregation's elected leadership. Hank's investigation had gradually led him to the unavoidable conclusion that Reverend Patterson himself was the primary architect of the embezzlement scheme. The pastor's position gave him unrestricted access to all financial records, the authority to approve expenditures without board oversight for amounts under a certain threshold, and the trust of congregation members who rarely questioned his financial decisions. Patterson had been systematically exploiting this trust for his own benefit, using stolen church funds to supplement his modest salary and finance a lifestyle that would have been impossible on his legitimate income alone. The evidence that Hank had assembled painted a portrait of breathtaking betrayal by someone who had taken sacred vows to serve God and shepherd his congregation with integrity and compassion. Patterson had been stealing money designated for charitable work, diverting funds meant to help struggling families in the community, and essentially robbing the church members who sacrificed their own resources to support what they believed was God's work in Cedar Falls. The moral dimensions of the crime were as devastating as the financial impact, representing a fundamental violation of the trust that formed the foundation of religious community. As Hank prepared for his confrontation with Patterson on that October evening, he had carefully documented every aspect of the embezzlement scheme, creating a comprehensive file that would provide irrefutable evidence of the pastor's crimes. His folder contained photocopies of altered invoices, bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, and detailed analyses of financial discrepancies that revealed the systematic nature of the theft. Hank had approached his investigation with the same thoroughness and attention to detail that had made him an effective military leader, understanding that accusations against a respected religious leader would require overwhelming evidence to be credible. The personal cost of uncovering this corruption had weighed heavily on Hank's conscience throughout his investigation. Patterson had been a friend as well as his pastor, someone with whom Hank had shared countless conversations about faith, service, and the challenges of living according to Christian principles in an increasingly secular world. The discovery that this trusted spiritual leader had been systematically betraying his congregation created a crisis of faith that challenged Hank's fundamental beliefs about human nature, institutional authority, and the reliability of religious leadership. Despite the personal pain of confronting Patterson's betrayal, Hank's sense of duty to the congregation and his commitment to justice made it impossible for him to ignore the evidence he had uncovered. His military service had taught him that leadership sometimes required making difficult decisions that served the greater good, even when those decisions carried significant personal costs. His faith had instilled in him a deep conviction that truth and righteousness must prevail over comfort and convenience, regardless of the immediate consequences for individuals or institutions. The meeting that Patterson had requested for that Tuesday evening represented a crucial moment in Hank's investigation. an opportunity to confront the pastor with the evidence of his crimes and demand accountability for the betrayal of trust that had damaged the church's mission and violated the sacred relationship between clergy and congregation. Hank had entered that meeting prepared to give Patterson an opportunity to confess his crimes and make restitution, hoping that the man he had respected and trusted for years would choose redemption over continued deception. Standing in the basement of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, with a flashlight beam illuminating the mysterious wooden surface 4 feet below, Jake Morrison faced a decision that would define not only his own character, but potentially transform the entire community of Cedar Falls. The weight of 20 years of unanswered questions pressed down on him like the tons of concrete that had been poured over whatever lay beneath the church floor. His 3 crew members, Tommy Chen, Maria Santos, and Pete Kowalski, waited silently for his leadership, their faces reflecting the same mixture of dread and moral certainty that gripped Jake's chest. The evidence before them demanded action, but Jake understood that once they committed to excavating further, there would be no turning back from whatever truth they uncovered. His mind raced through the potential consequences of their decision, the impact on Margaret Sullivan, who had spent 20 years wondering what had happened to her husband, the effect on the current congregation of St. Matthew's, many of whom had been devastated by Hank's disappearance, and the broader implications for a community that had built its identity around trust, faith, and the belief that justice would ultimately prevail. Jake pulled out his cell phone and made the first of several calls that would set in motion the events that would finally bring resolution to the mystery of Hank Sullivan's disappearance. His first call was to Reverend Patricia Holloway, the current pastor of St. Matthew's, who needed to be informed immediately about what they had discovered beneath her church. The conversation was brief, but loaded with implications that both Jake and Reverend Holloway understood without having to articulate them explicitly. Within minutes of Jake's call, Reverend Holloway arrived at the church, her face pale with the shock of learning that the foundation repair project had uncovered what appeared to be evidence related to the most traumatic event in the congregation's recent history. As she descended into the basement and saw the wooden surface that Jake's crew had exposed, her composure cracked slightly, revealing the emotional weight of serving a congregation that had never fully healed from the trauma of losing one of its most beloved leaders under mysterious circumstances. Jake's second call was to the Cedar Falls Police Department, where Chief Robert Martinez listened with growing amazement as the construction foreman described their discovery. Martinez had been a young patrol officer in 1989 when Hank Sullivan disappeared, and the case had haunted him throughout his career, representing the one major investigation that had never been resolved despite extensive efforts by local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. The possibility that answers might finally be within reach sent a surge of adrenaline through the veteran police officer, who immediately dispatched a team of investigators to St. Matthew's. The third call went to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the state medical examiner, whose expertise would be crucial in determining exactly what lay beneath the wooden surface and whether it represented evidence of the crime that many people had suspected but never been able to prove. Dr. Walsh's reputation for meticulous forensic investigation and her experience with cold cases made her the ideal professional to handle what promised to be one of the most significant criminal discoveries in Iowa's recent history. As word of the discovery spread through Cedar Falls, with the speed that only small-town communications networks could achieve, residents began gathering outside St. Matthew's Church, drawn by police cars, news vans, and the collective understanding that something momentous was happening at the heart of their community. Margaret Sullivan, now 73 years old and living in a retirement community in nearby Waterloo, received a phone call from Chief Martinez informing her that developments in her husband's case required her immediate attention. The excavation Protest that followed was painstakingly slow and methodical, conducted under the supervision of forensic specialists who understood that any evidence recovered from beneath the church floor might be crucial in prosecuting crimes that had been committed 2 decades earlier. Using brushes, small hand tools, and photographic equipment, the investigators carefully removed the remaining concrete around the wooden surface, revealing what appeared to be a handcrafted burial container that had been sealed with extraordinary care and attention to detail. When the wooden lid was finally opened, the contents confirmed the worst fears and darkest suspicions that had haunted Cedar Falls for 20 years. The remains inside were identified through dental records as those of Harold "Hank" Sullivan, the missing deacon whose disappearance had never been adequately explained despite extensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. The condition of the remains and the artifacts found with them told a story of violence and deliberate concealment that transformed a missing person case into a murder investigation. The evidence recovered from the burial chamber painted a clear picture of what had happened during Hank's final meeting with Reverend Patterson on that October evening in 1989. The financial documents that Hank had brought to confront the pastor about his embezzlement were found with his remains, along with a handwritten confession that Patterson had apparently forced Hank to sign before killing him. The confession detailed Hank's supposed involvement in the missing church funds, a document that would have destroyed his reputation and credibility if it had ever been discovered during his lifetime. Forensic analysis revealed that Hank had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object such as a hammer or crowbar. The positioning of his remains and the careful way they had been preserved suggested that Patterson had planned the murder in advance, preparing the burial chamber and developing a strategy for concealing the crime that would allow him to continue his embezzlement without interference from the one person who had uncovered his scheme. The investigation that followed Hank's discovery revealed the full scope of Patterson's crimes and the elaborate cover-up that had kept them hidden for 2 decades. Financial records from the late 1980s and early 1990s showed that Patterson had continued his embezzlement after Hank's murder, eventually stealing more than $100,000 from the church before his own death from cancer in 1998. The 1991 basement renovation that had sealed Hank's grave had been funded with stolen church money, adding another layer of cruel irony to the pastor's crimes. The revelation of Patterson's guilt brought both closure and renewed grief to the Cedar Falls community, which had to confront the reality that one of their spiritual leaders had been a murderer who had exploited their trust for his own benefit. Margaret Sullivan, who had waited 20 years for answers about her husband's fate, found some measure of peace in finally learning the truth, even though it confirmed that her worst fears about foul play had been justified all along. The discovery beneath St. Matthew's altar also validated the instincts and moral courage of Jake Morrison and his construction crew, whose decision to investigate an unusual finding had finally brought justice to a crime that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Their willingness to trust their suspicions and pursue the truth despite potential personal and professional risks demonstrated the kind of individual courage that makes communities stronger and safer for everyone. Jake Morrison's role in uncovering the truth about Hank Sullivan's murder became a defining moment in his life, reinforcing his belief in the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. The experience strengthened his commitment to his community and his understanding of how individual actions can have far-reaching consequences for justice and healing. The story of Hank Sullivan's disappearance and the eventual discovery of his remains serves as a powerful reminder that truth has a way of emerging even when powerful people work to suppress it, and that ordinary citizens have both the opportunity and the responsibility to stand up for justice when they encounter evidence of wrongdoing. Jake Morrison's decision to investigate what he found beneath St. Matthew's altar exemplifies the kind of moral courage that transforms communities and ensures that victims of crime are not forgotten. If this incredible true story of courage, justice, and the power of following your instincts has moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these amazing real-life stories. Share this video with friends and family who appreciate tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Jake Morrison's situation. Your support helps us continue bringing you the most compelling true stories of human courage and determination from around the world.